Alright, hello everyone. Welcome back to another video about historical period number 7 of the APUSH curriculum. Today we have key concept 7.1.3 about the Great Depression and the New Deal. Now remember, for this unit and this unit only, we're watching the videos out of order. So this should be the 7th video that you are watching in this unit, even though it is towards the beginning of the concept outline. 7th video here, all about the Great Depression and the New Deal. So before, what we've talked about is the beginning of this huge economic recession that gets so bad that it goes into a region that we call a depression in the business cycle. Okay, that's when it lasts a lot longer without any sort of bottoming out, which is to show you that it really is one of the worst economic crises that the nation has ever faced. Now, most of this presentation is going to focus on the major response to the Great Depression, known as the New Deal. Sort of what it was trying to do and the effects that it has on American society, economy, and politics. It really affected everything in the nation at the time for years to come. Alright, the first thing we're going to talk about is sort of the Great Depression and what was going on with early responses to it. Now, this slide refers to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, but first we need to talk about the responses that occurred from the president before Franklin D. Roosevelt, Herbert Hoover. Now, if you remember from when we talked about economics in the 1920s, I told you Herbert Hoover was one of these Republican presidents that represented letting the business cycle work itself out, thinking that the government should not be interfering in the economy, and that's really sort of seen also in how Republican presidents in the 1920s took the approach of laissez-faire capitalism and not having regulations on the economy, which helped to cause the Great Depression in the first place. Now, when the Great Depression begins, Herbert Hoover is the president, and his plan is that basically through good works, so voluntarism and charity organizations, that is where people should get assistance, not from the government, and that if people work hard and are sort of individualistic, that's going to help fix the depression, that the business cycle will work itself out. And this is his policy for the first couple years, but the economy continues to deteriorate, and there's is no sign that it's going to work out on its own. So he does eventually create some governmental attempts to sort of fix the depression without sort of abandoning his conservative ideals when it comes to economics. One of this was working with Congress to pass a new tariff. If you remember, in the past, Republicans were always in favor of high tariffs in order to collect money for the federal government. This one's called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and what happened is it put a very high tariff on foreign goods. Now, the thing you have to know about the Great Depression is that it was so bad that it was not just an American phenomenon, it was affecting the whole world. So what that means is that other countries were resentful that during poor economic times, we were making economics even more difficult for them. Their countries could now not even do as well if they couldn't trade well with the United States. So they also put up high tariffs against us, which meant that this tariff did not help us in the end, and we actually sunk further into the Great Depression despite this attempt. All right? Another late attempt that he tried to sort of address the Great Depression was creating something within the federal government called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Now, what this was is, if you've ever heard the term sort of corporate welfare before, that's what this is. It's the idea of the government giving money to big businesses, hoping that that money will, what's called, trickle down within to the economy. So Hoover was not willing to give direct money as relief to Americans, but he would give it to companies instead, hoping that the companies could then hire more people to create more goods, and then the economy would sort of get back on its feet. But it was not enough, and it was too late. So it was not an immediate response. It was several years into the Depression. The economy was already so bad that this was just kind of like a Band-Aid on a, gigantic deep wound that wasn't going to heal with just a little cosmetic fix. All right? So within all this time, you have to understand that people were very resentful of Herbert Hoover and his limited response. There was widespread discontent, and most people actually blamed Hoover for the Depression. Now, really, the Depression wasn't really Hoover's fault. It was the fault of his work, plus the combinations of sort of a long trend of things going on in the economy with overproduction and an overvalued stock market as well. So Hoover got the blame anyway. That's just the way it works for presidents, is they get blame for poor times, they get credit for good times when a lot of it is out of their hands. People hated Hoover so much that they would give sort of these nicknames to terrible things associated with the Great Depression with his name. So there were things called Hoovervilles. There's a picture of what that would look like on the top right there. These would be when people would get kicked out of their houses and they would find kind of empty lots or kind of woods to live in, and they would set up these shacks made out of plywood and cardboard and really whatever they could find. And they called them Hoovervilles to represent that it was Hoover's fault that they were living in slums instead of houses anymore. They called newspapers Hoover blankets because people couldn't afford blankets, so they would use newspapers when they were sleeping on the streets. They also called empty pockets Hoover flags, so if you're walking around with your pockets turned out, it means there's nothing in them, and that was Hoover's fault. Okay, now something that made this even worse for Hoover was when former sort of military veterans started protesting his lack of a response. And this was called the Bonus Army. So this is when 16,000 veterans from World War I marched on Washington. Now, these veterans had been promised a sort of bonus from the government for their service in World War I, but they weren't supposed to get it until like the 1940s, I believe. But they were saying, listen, we've lost all our jobs, and you are doing nothing about this. We want that bonus now so we can eat and, provide for our families. So all these men marched on Washington. Hoover was in this tough place as to what is he going to do. He ended up using force, using the National Guard to forcibly remove them and use tear gas. And when that was sort of put out into the media, it made him even more unpopular. So basically, Hoover never did anything that was actually going to help him not get the sort of the brunt of the blame for the Great Depression. On the other hand, a new presidential election was coming up, and there was a bright new face in there with Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt had been a politician for some time. He'd been a vice presidential candidate back in 1920. He'd served as governor of New York. So he was well known, and what he comes in with 1930 to 1932 is a completely radically different vision from what Herbert Hoover was offering. He said, I want to use the federal government to fix this problem. So by spending money instead of sitting back and waiting for it to fix itself. And because he offered this different vision, he got swept into a landslide victory against Hoover. And this is the era where we're going to start to see his New Deal, his new approach to the economy and the federal government's relationship with that. And that's what we'll see on the next slide. All right, so we're out with Hoover. Hoover does not get reelected, and Franklin D. Roosevelt becomes president. Now, what FDR promises is drastic changes within the very beginning of his administration. Early on, he gave things called his Fireside Chats, using sort of the widespread sort of owning of radios by most Americans to talk directly to the American people. They were called Fireside Chats because it's the idea of it would come on at night, you'd have a fire going, and there would be the president seeming like he's talking directly to you, encouraging you, and also telling you to be careful during these terrible, sort of scary economic times. And one of the things he really stressed was people having confidence in banks. I mentioned in the previous presentation that when the Great Depression got going, most banks failed because they no longer had the money to guarantee people who wanted to withdraw their money. And what he said is, trust the banks, put your money in there because the government's going to do something to make sure that they can't abuse your money anymore. All right. Within his first 100 days of office, he promised to radically change the federal government's relationship with the economy through several means, and this is what he was promoting in his Fireside Chats. One of them was in banking reform, so like I said, he encouraged people to have faith in banks, and he actually took steps to give people a reason to have faith in those banks. So, first of all, he declared things called bank holidays, and as fun as that sounds, a holiday for a bank is actually a bad thing. It means that they're forced to be closed by the federal government because they have shown that they are not trustworthy enough of people's money. He would not let them open until they could show that they have a set plan for how they're going to invest money wisely rather than be reckless as they were during the 1920s. Once they could prove that, he would allow them to open back up. Another thing he did is he created something called the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is still visible in banks if you go there today. It's an insurance program that at the beginning sort of insured people's deposits in their checking account to $2,500. That was a lot of money back then. Today it's up to, I believe, $250,000, okay? But the federal government is saying if the bank fails, then the federal government will make sure that you don't lose your life savings up to a certain amount. Later on in the New Deal, he'd also create something called the Glass-Steagall Act that would separate different types of banks into personal banks and investment banks, so that banks where they had money for the purpose of investing could be more risky with how they used it, but personal banks could not be as risky as they could, because that's where people are putting money that they want to use, not money that they're willing to risk on investments. Okay, so this was a major facet of the New Deal at the beginning. Another one was a new approach to agriculture. So we've talked about this a few times up along the way. Think back to populism and the free silver movement, where agriculture was in kind of this decline of prices, right? So what that meant is farmers were losing money, they were going into extreme debt, and as a process they would try to grow more crops. But growing more crops just resulted in the prices getting lower. FDR tried to take steps forward that would make sure that the farmers would basically get subsidies not to grow crops, to say, we'll pay you so you don't try to do this. In the process, prices will start to go back up. This one was done through the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA. Another approach had to do with manufacturing. So of course, if you recall, one of the reasons the Great Depression happened is that companies were making too much. They had too much of a supply with not enough demand. So there was this huge investment of money in making things that no one could buy. So FDR had a plan for that too. As they say, he had a program for every problem. This was called the NRA. That is not the National Rifle Association. It stands for the National Recovery Administration. Okay, and what it said is it placed quotas on production of goods and price limits to say to manufacturing sectors that you can't just create as much as you can. You need to create what the market demands rather than creating a huge supply that you're wasting money on in the process. Okay, trying to use money wisely in industry. And lastly, trying to figure out how to address the issue that employment was getting up to 27%. Usually, a healthy unemployment is somewhere between like 7 and 9%, and even 9% is kind of high. You want it to be pretty low, all right? So if we're up to 3 times the amount of people are unemployed than the ideal amount, the government says we need to do something about this to help people by creating jobs. So what were some administrations that created jobs? The Public Works Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration. All of these made jobs for young men to create new public goods. Public goods are things that we enjoy every day that the government creates. So roads, bridges, dams, national parks, all these different things that the federal government is in charge of keeping up, there weren't jobs to actually keep them up. So FDR said, well, let's sort of improve our infrastructure and give people jobs in the process. So we're not just giving out money just because, we're giving out money to improve our country in the process. And this is kind of one of these lasting legacies of the New Deal, is it creates a great infrastructure for our country. Now, something that we'll get to in just a minute is for everything FDR was trying to do here, and he creates hundreds of administrations and executive orders in order to directly address the Great Depression. There were questions about to what degree was he abusing his power as president. Did he have the authority to basically radically change our government's relationship with the economy? The Supreme Court said he did not have that much power. And in fact, they overruled some of his presidential executive branch administrations, like the AAA and the NRA, as unconstitutional. They said that it's Congress's job to make these sorts of things. It did not get rid of all of them. Some of them it said, okay, we'll allow these, but some of the major ones, like you see below there, they struck down and they no longer got to exist. And FDR is going to get into a bit of a pickle with the Supreme Court that we'll talk about in just a little bit. All right, this next slide is about, as FDR is pursuing this New Deal policy, there are responses from both ends of the political spectrum. Conservatives on the right, who felt like the New Deal was basically using the government in an inappropriate way to deal with the economy. They felt that the government had no place in the economy. On the other end of the spectrum, liberals and the Democrats felt like, in some cases, that the New Deal was not doing enough. So we're going to look at both sides of these criticisms. The main thing to realize here is that FDR was somewhere in the middle. That's where the New Deal was, and both sides had reasons to criticize him for it. So critics on the right said the New Deal was too radical and too liberal, and there were several associations that formed of people who were opposing this. So the Liberty League, the National Association of Manufacturers, there was a lot of support from the very wealthy upper class and from big business, because interference by the federal government in the economy meant regulation that they did not want. So they used their economic and political power to try and limit the extent of what was being done with the New Deal. Okay, so realizing the government as well in Congress, the Democrats had majorities in both houses of Congress, so FDR was mostly getting what he wanted. So Republicans and conservatives had to go about this sort of private sector way of approaching how to limit the New Deal. But conservatives did have significant allies in, like I said earlier, the Supreme Court. I already told you how they struck down the AAA and the NRA and many other ones, saying that it's going too far. They would look at FDR, like that picture on the top right, and saying that he's abusing his constitutional power. That picture there is supposed to show him lighting a cigarette with the Constitution on fire while giving a speech. Okay, so FDR did not like what the Supreme Court was doing. He felt like they were undermining his wholehearted attempt to fix the Great Depression. So what he did is he concocted this court packing scheme that went very, very horribly for him. His idea was that there is no set rule about how many justices are on the Supreme Court. To this day, we still have 9, but it's by acts of Congress and tradition that it goes this way. So FDR said, well, what if we can make a law in Congress that says for every justice over 70 years old, the president can appoint another one? Because basically the justices that were giving him problems were all really old. So he thought if he could get these people over 70 to have basically extra justices on there, they could counteract and his things wouldn't be found unconstitutional anymore. So he had this plan, but here's what happened. Both parties find out before he even tried to make it happen, and even people in his own party, the Democratic Party, said, this is going way too far. That is an obvious abuse of power. You cannot do that, and he basically had to back off. Now, it does not work, but he gets his way anyway, because some of the Supreme Court justices resign or die within the time of the Great Depression, and by the time FDR is done being president, he had appointed, I think, 8 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices when he dies in office. So he tried to sort of press his luck, didn't work, but he ended up getting his way anyway. All right, so these were conservative criticisms of the New Deal, and when those didn't work for very valid reasons, what did they do? They hurled accusations of communism and socialism at FDR. So remember, those had very radical negative connotations at the time. There are political cartoons putting FDR and his wife like riding a donkey to Moscow and trying to portray him that he's trying to turn our country into something like the Soviets had. If you really look at the political spectrum, the New Deal was kind of in the middle, but slightly to the left. Okay, because it's only slightly to the left because people on the left criticized FDR and the New Deal as well, saying it didn't do nearly enough to actually fix the problems of the Great Depression. Major critic of this, his name was Francis Townsend. And so what he was saying is he was looking at it from the perspective of the elderly. Now, a lot of the elderly had lost their life savings when all the banks failed. And he said, what do you do when you have people who can't work anymore because they're so old and there is no safety net to actually support them? The idea that Townsend had would eventually become the Social Security Act that exists to this very day that provides direct financial assistance to the elderly and the handicapped as well. Right? Another critic of FDR was someone much further to the left. His name was Huey Long. There he is looking like kind of an idiot on the bottom right. I don't know, he looks kind of dopey there if you ask me. He put forth an idea called the Share Our Wealth program. And if that sounds like communism, it's because when you hear the details, it's going to sound a lot like communism, or at least like socialism. His idea was taxing the rich extremely and limiting your personal income. So I can show you a chart of this in class. But what it basically looked like is if you made up to $1 million in a year, you did not pay a cent in taxes. And that's going to be about 99% of the population. But for every million you make over $1 million, you pay an increasingly large rate of it to the federal government in taxes, to the point that once you start making $8 million, anything you make more than $8 million, you give 100% of it to the federal government. So that's why it feels like socialism, because at some extent it was going to affect one group of people, the very wealthy, extremely at some point, but not affect 99% of the country. He had this phrase that his plan would make basically every man a king. He would say that no one would have too much or too little, and the government would have a positive role of trying to sort of manage the country's wealth so that there aren't these huge income gaps like developed in the 1920s. One last idea we'll talk about was from our old buddy Upton Sinclair, the guy who wrote The Jungle, the muckraker, and his idea basically was communism. So he was running for governor of California. He did not win, but he got close. And he wanted to create a system where the state, so just California for his plan, would round up everyone who was homeless or unemployed and basically put them in communes out in the countryside and force them to live in their own little society, creating things in factories and growing things to barter until the Great Depression improved. So that system wasn't going to work, and enough people thought that it wouldn't work, so he did not get elected. But it just demonstrates one of these very, very radically left ideas of people saying that the New Deal wasn't doing enough. So your question now is, what actually happened? Did FDR actually lean to the right or lean to the left to address these concerns? His response really does make sense. So he's getting criticism by people who have different political ideas from him, people who have similar ones. So which one is he likely going to get more support from if he kind of gives into their demands? People on his own side. So he ignored the criticisms from the right, called them economic royalists, saying that they don't even understand what's going on, they're so out of the loop. And what he does instead is he creates something called the Second New Deal, and he shifts from just changing the economy and giving relief directly to people to reforming the economy so that future depressions don't happen again. A few of the acts of Congress that he worked to get passed: the Wagner Act, so this is supporting unions, saying workers cannot be fired for unionizing. The Supreme Court had earlier said that unions were legal, but there was no act of Congress to establish that they were sort of legal completely. It's the Supreme Court decision was kind of a mixed bag. Next up, the Social Security Act, which was a response to the criticism of Francis Townsend from before. And another thing that goes in lines with kind of the CCC and this is the WPA, the Civil Works Administration, those ones from the previous slide. This one was called the WPA. So it's going to do the same thing those others were doing, maintaining, fixing, and building new roads, bridges, parks, buildings, airports, basically rebuilding our infrastructure and building it up so that that money that the federal government could be spending this money anyway, but now they're going to be spending it basically to give relief to people who are unemployed by giving them jobs, right? So something that you need to know about the Great Depression is look at all this stuff that FDR is doing. It did not really fix the Great Depression, okay? There's actually, things showed improvement, and then things get worse actually during FDR's own attempts. So this is what kind of the next slide gets to. Notice it mentions that the New Deal did not end the Great Depression, but it did radically change the way that the federal government operates in the economy. And that's really the takeaway you need to have here. One takeaway is support for labor unions. Because the federal government, through the Wagner Act, was now saying unions are legal, there was an increase in membership, which meant that sort of the people, the laboring poor, had more of a voice in society than they did during the 1920s when, the business of America is supporting business, right? A new union is also created, the CIO. They eventually merged with the AFL later on as well. Other things, kind of miscellaneous legacies: gender relations during the Great Depression and the New Deal. Women were still less likely to find jobs, okay? Of course, this is going to happen. Women were viewed sort of in a subservient position, so as the conditions are bad, when they did have jobs, they were actually paid less for the same work, and most of those programs that we've talked about excluded women completely. Race relations. So this is the era when African Americans start voting for the Democrats as a voting bloc. They used to vote for the Republicans, right, because of the legacy of Lincoln and Reconstruction, but now in the Great Depression, who is actually helping African Americans, trying to get them jobs, trying to sort of change things? The Democrats and not the Republicans. The Republicans were basically the party of no, saying, no, we're not going to do that. So this shows major sort of demographic shifts in voting trends, but realize that just as the Democratic Party is changing their economic stance, the Democratic Party is still the party of the KKK and Jim Crow in the South. Now, the New Deal changes the Democratic Party in economic terms, but not in social terms, so please keep that in mind. Indian relations improved a little bit as well. The Dawes Act was reversed, and one of the New Deal programs granted more religious and cultural sovereignty to Native American tribes, trying to fix some of the problems created before. Now, it doesn't fix all the problems, but it is a step in the right direction. All right, one thing that he did that tried to reform things entirely was using land and water and our natural resources for responsible use instead of abuse by companies. So, something that's inspiring him to do this has to do with the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains of America. Now, the Great Depression was already happening, and then about 3 years into it, what happens? A huge geological sort of climate-related disaster in the middle of the country. This is the area where farmers had been over-cultivating the land for generations, trying to make money, but driving down the prices of crops in the process. Well, it all came to bite them back in the you-know-what. What happened is they were using the land so much, let alone land that wasn't meant to grow corn or grain, that it was completely rid of nutrients, and when storm cycles came through, it would whip up all the topsoil, get rid of everything that had nutrients, and the whole middle of the country is basically turned into this desert. There was a drought, and basically you couldn't grow things there anymore. There were gigantic dust storms, why it's called the Dust Bowl, that were so bad that people would get it stuck in their lungs and then have like infections because of it. What happened as a result? Huge migration changes that we talked about in another video. A lot of these people are called the Okies because so many were from Oklahoma, with eventually 350,000 people moving to California from the Great Plains area, seeking new jobs, seeking farmland that theirs had basically disappeared. Okay, once they got there, conditions were not much better, and they're actually very much discriminated against because they were viewed as kind of like the other again, people who did not belong and who were trying to get into California, who was already facing the Depression already. So what did the New Deal do? It basically tried to create those agricultural reforms like the AAA to change how the land was used, but also restore the land for use. The New Deal would go through the Great Plains and build like kind of wind blocks and fake hills, because one of the reasons that these storms could sweep through and take away all this good soil was because it's so flat. So strategic hills were built, new crop rotation cycles were developed, and we see that within the next couple decades, this sort of thing, well, to this day, hasn't really happened again because the New Deal put these regulatory and land use institutions into effect. Another use of the land was called the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which sought to control the very large Tennessee River Valley and to use that water to create electricity with dams. So the federal government would build the dams, the water would go through them, and sort of use the pressure from the water to create electricity by turning gigantic turbines. Okay, there was a lot of pushback from the South over this because they thought it was violating their state's rights to do this on their own. FDR said, tough luck, someone has to do it, and the federal government's going to be the one to do it. Okay, the New Deal also took on what are we going to do with tortured artists, right? So already starving artists already have enough trouble finding work, right? So what's going to happen in the New Deal? It's even worse. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration I mentioned before, hired writers and artists to document the New Deal, so they would make propaganda and advertising for it, but they also recorded many oral histories from the very elderly, so from former slaves, from people like on the right, experienced the Dust Bowl, like that migrant mother. Like John Steinbeck works for the WPA during the Great Depression, and that his experiences eventually kind of influence his writing, which you'll, I know you read in English class with The Grapes of Wrath, Cannery Row, etc., etc. Okay? Now, what is the big thing we need to take away from the New Deal? That it has a lasting legacy, because from this point on, the federal government has a permanent and increased job in regulating the economy. The term for this is called Keynesian Economics, and it's different from the classical economic theory. Classical economic theory is the business cycle, right? Keynesian Economics says that we want to limit expansion so we can limit recessions. We'll still have overall growth, but We don't want to have extreme growth and extreme depressions anymore. And FDR's attempts with the New Deal start to push us in that direction instead of with a classical economic theory with laissez-faire economics. Other thing you need to know too is that it does help to realign our political parties economically, but not socially. So if you look on that giant timeline in my class of political party history, we're at the turning point here, where the Democrats switch to the left and the Republicans switch to the right in terms of centralized government and what they think about it. This is a major point, which will then be solidified over the next 3 decades or so, and eventually lead to kind of a shift in social points of view, which get the political parties to where they are today in our modern times. Alright, thank you so much for watching. You know what you've got to do next. You've got some terms to create, red and yellow terms. Make sure that those terms are relevant to the Great Depression and the New Deal. Thank you very much. You've got a quiz to do by 8 a.m. You've got geography to work on, chronology to study, and as always, another video to watch if you're into that sort of thing. So this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I'll see you in class. Bye.